Okay, so I wanted to do a video. I've watched a bunch of these uh, videos from Based Camp, from Simone and Malcolm Collins, that Paul had on his channel recently. And I think it's very interesting. Obviously, I can see why he's interested in it. And, I'm very much in favor of pro natalism, and I think um, I've I think I've expressed that in other places. I think that it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate that evangelical Christianity and a lot of Christian traditions, or whatever, have sort of, in my opinion, downplayed the centrality or the importance of people becoming parents and having kids, and in light of how it's presented in the Bible, it's kind of like the first command and one of the central ones, and never really is removed from things. And I think, if anything, thinking about God as a father, he's a father who very much desires to have many children. And I think that the act of becoming a parent is one of the most good, transformative events that can happen in a person's life. Nothing brings more maturity than realizing you're responsible for taking care of a kid. So between people getting married and having kids, I think that is really a super important transformative event in a person's life. And it's something that we should be encouraging, because the people who will save the world, essentially, are the people who value those things. Because the people who don't value having children will cease to exist, basically. But there is some things that I think are different about how they're looking at this from compared to like a more Christian way. And they have their weird homemade religion, which they explained a little bit, like on Paul's channel, or he's played some clips. And I haven't watched a ton, but I watched about 10 videos or so. I watched some of the most recent ones and some of the other ones that were on various subjects of interest. But I thought I would kind of, rather than pulling clips and all that, I'm just going to kind of go through and give my thoughts and the summaries of what they said. And most of the stuff I agree with what they think, and I think that it's really important because they're coming at this from they don't have any dogmatic position that they're basing their inquiries on, as far as studying these things and why this is the way to go, which is interesting because I think that they are being honest and speaking about a lot of issues that Christians kind of want to circumvent and want to avoid. And what I would say is that here's the pros and the cons. So their thing is totally centered on this sort of pronatalist idea, this idea of having big families and supporting people that have big families. And they're really more or less on the side of the smart people who understand how smart this is are the ones that should do this. And there is something appealing about their confidence in that, like, well, we're the ones that figured this out, so we are the ones who are going to succeed in influencing the next generation, because we're the ones that are going to be parenting the next generation. And like, as you look further down, they had one that was about these dinks, and that was the thing that went around a bit, the dual income, no kids people. And they're basically like, we don't want them to have kids because they're selfish, and we hope that their genes aren't passed on. So the one thing I would say that is interesting about this, or where do they come from as far as like building their systems of values and stuff? Like, they are not believing necessarily in spirit as we would maybe describe it, or a spiritual thing, or that the nature of religious revelation is spiritual, but they're very materialistic, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's just where they are. And Darwinism seems to be underlying their thinking in this. Now, I think they're going to hit a little bit of an inconsistency if they don't, and I don't know if this is in there somewhere, if they don't challenge what is meant by Darwinism or something like that. Or, because I think what the problem with Darwinism, as it's often taught, is this idea that the mechanism that drives it forward is survival of the fittest. And fittest is like, the apex predator. It's the one who is strongest, and those are the genes that get selected to pass on, and the weak die out. But in reality, I think the way that it works, and this is more or less echoed in what they're promoting, is the mechanism is something more like survival of the fruitful, which is a very biblical idea. If you are the branch that is not fruitful is cut off, and when we look at like creatures or whatever that are going to survive, it's the ones that produce a lot more so than the ones that necessarily produce like the apex creature. The Uberman or whatever. In some ways, that's that you kind of get into this thing of in that hideous strength where the idea is like, well, you have this one perfect human, and then you don't need to have the other humans anymore. It's kind of like, I think there's an aspect of this, like in Plato, that like if there is a perfect form, everything that derives from it or everything that's downstream of it is lesser. And I think that is kind of upside down from the Christian view, really, and upside down from the way that they're actually kind of living and promoting this message, because one seed produces many fruit, and the one seed has all that potential in it, but it's not better than the 100 fruit that it produces. And those fruits are also seeds that can go 100 more generations or whatever. So I think that when we look at the Bible and the way that God presents this command to be fruitful and multiply, and this is something that I've looked at really closely, moral questions about like God wanting to like keep the good people and punish the bad people, like that really obscures the way that we view a lot of the way this stuff is going forth from the text. And even so much as to say, like, with the parable of the wheat and the tares, God sows a field with good seed, and then all these junk seeds are spread in there, and he says, let's just let them all grow, and then at the end we'll collect everything, and that's when we'll get rid of the bad stuff. So God is very much in favor of having fields full of things growing, and the sorting part is his job, and when it happens is at the end. So they're kind of a little bit choosy in this thing of like, well, we don't want these dink people to have kids, and then they're just okay with that, or they very much are wanting people. How can I say this? They're not evangelists for their thing. If you get their thing, great. If you don't get their thing, what they're all about, they are not interested in you participating. Which I feel like that may ultimately be the Achilles heel of their movement. The only mechanism they have is reproduction. That's the only mechanism they have to grow. Now, some of this, I think, this anti-evangelistic viewpoint comes from the way that they view their nemesis, I guess, the thing they're trying to combat, which they call the urban monoculture. And when they're saying the urban monoculture, well, first of all, that's like, you couldn't have a better description of the Tower of Babel. They built a tower and then a city, and then everybody had one language and one speech and one, it's a monoculture, and it's urban, it's in the city. So and that the problem with that is that the only way it grows is by peeling people off the top. It doesn't reproduce on its own. And so I think that they are in preferencing reproduction so highly as like the central mechanism for growth of the good part of civilization. They're rejecting evangelistic efforts or efforts of persuasion, efforts to convince people to come over to their side. So I would say, in one hand, that's very antithetical to Christianity. Christianity, I think, and I would especially say like evangelical Christianity or whatever, it has lost sight of the centrality of this command to be fruitful and multiply. For such a long time, it didn't need to emphasize that because it was the societal norm of everybody for like all time. But now that we've gotten into this place where people are living in this urban monoculture lifestyle, or affluence is causing drops in birth rate, it does need to be reemphasized, because what we've done is we've assumed that people will always keep being born, both within and without the church. And what we focus on is being a welcoming place to the fringe. And I think this is the thing, that essentially there's a lot of exceptional groups that they don't care about. And they say, we don't care. If you're not on board with our thing, we're not interested in you. We're focusing on our thing. If you get our thing, you can be part of our movement. If you don't, you go be in your own thing. And they're kind of, it's not to say that they're not competing, because they value diversity of worldviews and diversity of culture. And so basically they're saying, like, if you're a Christian and you have a big family and you like this thing, that's great. Just stay in your lane. We'll be glad to have you be participating in the future. And same thing if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, or whatever. So if you're in a traditional religion, as they say, and you're choosing to have a big family, they're all in favor of that, and they're happy for people to do so. But they are building this thing around their own weird homemade religion. And comparing some of the religious aspects of between that and Christianity, I think it highlights some interesting things. So going through this list here, so I guess in reverse order, so the video that came out today, the real immigration crisis, sending back skilled immigrants and keeping the crappy ones, and what the question being, what do pro-natalists think of immigrants? And they are in favor of immigrants because, as they, America's a nation of immigrants, and their kind of thing is that what makes people like good Americans is part of this immigrant thing, because the people that came over who faced trials, tribulations, hard times, but they saw the opportunity to come to America as a chance at success, not a guarantee of success, but a chance. Those people who most saw it for what it was and recognized it, came over, worked hard, made it happen. That's the American dream. The American dream is the chance. It's not the actuality. And a lot of successful immigrants have realized that. Most Americans are descended from immigrants at some point. That's certainly the case in my family. But what they were saying is basically the way things are going now, we're making it it's more difficult for the good ones, the ones that come through the merit-based system, and instead we're letting all these illegal immigrants through. But what they're also saying is that, like, conservatives more or less need to figure out how to capture that group, largely a Hispanic population, if they want to have any success. And a little bit I talked about this book here, Embracing the New Samaria by Alejandro Mendez. And it's the tagline there is opening our eyes to our multi-ethnic future. And he basically really highlights the fact that, like, churches, he's thinking about churches. If churches are going to grow, and I think that's analogous to any sort of cultural thing, they have to embrace multiculturalism to a certain degree, but not in the way that urban monoculture does, where you have identity of thought. It actually values like the way that different cultures communicate, the way that they'll express themselves, and actually valuing those diverse viewpoints. But what he's saying is more or less like Anglo churches need to welcome some of the immigrants that are in their community already into the church if they want the church to thrive. And really the same thing goes for like the Spanish, there's many Spanish only churches in America, but it's going to be increased. Like, they're not necessarily trying to maintain a Spanish only culture. And as subsequent generations are born here, they're going to be more English speaking and more English centered. And so those churches will also die out. So this is one area where I would say I really like their view, and I feel like it's very underrepresented in the Christian worldview, or especially in like the trad churches. And there was another video I watched where they talked about like what's wrong with the trad thing. And the trad movements, Catholic, if it's Ortho Bros, if it's Reformed people, Reformed Baptists, Presbyterians, the Doug Wilson group, they really... It's interesting because I think a lot of the better leaders don't really have a problem with like racial diversity or cultural diversity, but the people slightly downstream of them really are worried more or less about like our kids are going to lose their cultural heritage. And it's like, well, that's up to you as an individual parent to maintain that, and you don't have to get rid of the people that are different from you to do it. So, and really, like, racism is not a good thing, and it's it's not the winning argument. And so I would say, insofar as I like a lot of what those sorts of movements promote, close families, good church communities, taking care of the community around you, focus on, like classical schools or homeschooling and all that stuff. Like, I think all that stuff is great, but if you're doing it because you want your kids to have a certain, like, upbringing and marry people that look like they could be their cousins, you're doing it for the wrong reason. And I don't think that it's biblical, and I think it's actually foolish. So I think Malcolm and Simone are right on that video over the Christians. So this next one here from the day before, people used to like their parents. And so Malcolm, because he's some sort of a weird famous family in like this area of Texas, he finds random books that were written by or about his family members. So he was sharing this book about his great-great-great-grandfather and his thoughts on family, and talking about how like his ancestor was talking about how great his parents were, how wonderful they were, how great they took care of him. And I think this is a great video. I think that that's a really good thing to do, and a lot of that is very much about your choice as to how you view your parents. And what they kind of talk about is that in the urban monoculture, there is this way to look at your childhood and your upbringing as like, my parents were idiots, or my parents were awful, like they were abusers. And it's either about like, I was victimized and therefore like I need special assistance, or I overcame great tragedy in my upbringing, and therefore I'm to be admired. And so it's this thing that, like, hating your parents is a rite of passage. And um, you know, I think I might talk about it more in things that I wrote, but it's like, I can look back on my childhood, and I could easily craft a narrative where I was a victim and my parents were terrible and horrible and blah blah blah. But in reality, and as I listened to many other stories of other people who um, were raised in different circumstances, my original thought that I have great parents is accurate. And they made mistakes, but they did the best they could. And so, um, me choosing to view things that way is really beneficial for myself and for my own family. They also talked a bit about, like, I think some of their parenting style in there, and I know somewhere in here there's a video where they talk about Jordan Peterson's parenting advice will create simps or something like that. I didn't watch that one, um, but I do appreciate, like, they're focused on preserving the strong will of their children, and um, so it's not like, in a lot of these really conservative movements about that are obsessed with parenting and child rearing and having big families, a lot of it is the discipline is, like, so centered on, like, just creating obedient children, and I think it does destroy a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination. And I think that God created a he didn't make human beings to be perfectly compliant robots, and that must have been to some degree by design. And so I think there's something to that. Now, I don't know exactly what, like I said, I don't know what they exactly don't like about Jordan Peterson's parenting advice. And I think as parents, there is something where children push boundaries, and there is a contest of wills because they want to know you're in charge. And I made a comment that basically saying, like, if a kid, if a 3-year-old says I hate you to their parents, and the parent, the right thing to do is to stand your ground and say, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm doing this because I love you, forcing them to finish their dinner, basically, or whatever. And if you can do it in a loving way, the child will realize that your will is more powerful than theirs, and ultimately it makes them happier because they know they're not they want to be in charge, or that's what their rebellious nature tells them. But to actually be in charge of, like, everything as a little kid is terrifying. And so I think that they appreciate knowing that parents love them, and part of loving means enforcing boundaries and things like that. So I mean, overall, it's a pretty good trade-off. Like, my kids know, or most of the time know, like, they don't get to eat whatever they want whenever they want, but they don't have to worry about finding their own food or clothes or shelter or any of those things. So the benefits outweigh the cost. But anyway, the overall message I thought was good. And I think just people need to, like, honestly evaluate their parents, especially, and I think it's easier once you become a parent to reflect more positively on your upbringing. So if anyone has not done that, and I would suggest doing that. Okay, so then the next one from 2 days ago was New York Times promoting eugenics in favor of short people, and saying, like, oh, people should mate with short people to fight climate change. Now, this one, I think, it was obviously that article is stupid, and like they were saying, you couldn't make the same argument about, like, thin people, because you can't say that being overweight is, like, someone's fault or something. I don't know. It's just, because that's like body shaming, and that's a big taboo. Um, but they were talking a little bit about some of this stuff that like um, because they are in favor of like reproductive technologies, and they're saying like, oh well, if you're gonna do IVF and you're gonna choose, the way they do it now is that they make a whole bunch of these embryos, and they're saying we can test which ones have which features, and we can select the ones that have the best features. And things like IVF are very controversial, and I think there's definitely for a Christian big ethical concerns about, especially about how it's done right now, because those fertilized embryos, the, from a Christian standpoint, there really is no distinguishing that from a living human. It is essentially a living human, although it's being purposely created, and then if not selected, denied the opportunity to grow and flourish into a human being. Now, I think so you have sort of Christians that are like, well, this is bad, we just got to shut it down. They want to shut everything down. It's like, okay, I understand that, but if Christian nationalists or whatever become in control of the nation and put laws into effect to shut all this stuff down, guaranteed there will be some sort of unforeseen consequences. Like if the biological ability for people to reproduce is more and more diminished, people could actually die out. There's a lot that goes into this stuff. I think that rather than just shutting it down, the best thing would be to work on perfecting these technologies so they could be done in the most ethical way. Because if two people are married and they're not relying on donated materials from other people outside of their marriage, there's not really anything wrong with it if you're not wasting these embryos. So that would be the it's done in a wasteful way now. If they were easily able to harvest one egg and fertilize one embryo and put the one embryo into the woman's uterus, and she could give birth to the one child without creating and either destroying or freezing all these other embryos, then it's really not that unethical of a thing. It's the wastefulness of it and the way that it's done, and especially the way it's done for profit. Now, there's another interesting thing that they don't talk about here that, we say like, okay, it's not a good thing that those extra embryos have been created, but now that they have been and they're out there in the world, there are actually people who, having reproductive issues, instead of harvesting their eggs or getting donor eggs or donor sperm, they're going to these places where the embryos are frozen, and they're taking these unused frozen embryos that somebody else paid for, didn't end up using, and they're taking those embryos and actually having those be implanted and gestating these embryos into babies. It's like really weird because there's a few people now that are born recently, but they were essentially conceived like 15 and 20 years ago. And it's like, wow, it's really weird. Like, how old is that person in some ways? We do measure age off of birth, but in a real sense, like that person's biological parents are now old, but were young when they were conceived. So it's like very weird, but that is an ethical thing that can be done to redeem a choice that was maybe not so ethical, that on the part of the people that created all these extra embryos and had them frozen. So that's where like I appreciate their pragmatic approach to things, because it's like, well, some of these, if the Christians decide they're not going to do something for ethical reasons, it doesn't mean somebody else won't. And if those people will, or if somebody else does these things, we have to wrestle with the reality of the fact that it exists and it happens. So that one was a little interesting. Not honestly, not too much to disagree with. They've said some more weird or extreme things other places that I think are more um, questionable. Like, eventually, if they can make basically embryonic cells out of other things, you could have children that legitimately have two fathers because you're using like skin cells to create the embryo instead of sperm and egg. So that's weird and pretty messed up. And I don't know exactly how to think about that. That leads me to the thing of, if people are trying to push the boundaries on this, that may be the sort of thing that instigates, a cataclysmic event that sets technology back a few hundred years or something. The motivation behind something like that. Okay, so then this other one, 5 days ago, the Mormon transhumanist movement. And they talked to these Mormon guys who are transhumanists, and it's interesting because it's different from the transhumanism of that hideous strength. It's not the thing of trying to like upload our consciousness to the cloud. It's much more about lengthening lifespan and increasing fertility. And basically, it's this thing of like, oh, well, we can perfect the human race and stuff like that. I mean, but then if you look at like verses in the Bible where it talks about somebody dying at 100 and it being a tragedy, well, if that's in the future, like, how's that prophecy going to be fulfilled somehow? We could just say it's that's in the millennial kingdom or something, whatever. Maybe that's the case, but like, if God created the I take the Bible pretty to be factually true, and I don't think it's necessarily symbolic or whatever, like those long ages of the people prior to the flood and even after, hundreds of years, living hundreds of years, like, well, then that kind of seems to indicate that originally God created human genetics in such a way that supported that, and maybe that could be recovered, because I think that there is a restoration of things, and that's a biblical concept. It's just kind of weird to be like, let's be the ones monkeying around in the lab, and this is kind of like, maybe I could, you could see, because I'm not an anti-technology person, like, and I think that is a real problem in a lot of these other kind of traditional movements or whatever, is that the technology is gonna happen, and we can do the thing where it's just like, the evil people use the technology, and then once they screw it all up, but we more or less understand it, like, then it's okay to use, like, so we're just letting, so maybe that's just the way we just let the evil people make the mistakes, and then we'll use it once all the kinks are worked out. I don't know. It's a little odd. But it was somewhat of an interesting interview. Okay, so then going on to this next batch here. Is 5 kids really easier and cheaper than 2? The weird math of large families. And that was a good, pretty practical, straightforward video. And they're more or less explaining, like, having bigger families, it necessitates making different choices. You have to make different choices about what you're going to do, like with family vacations, the cars you drive, the places you go, how often you eat out, or things like that. And those are sort of practical things that having a big family forces you into that. Having a big family also probably forces you into figuring out how to earn more money and things like that. It gives you a motivation. But the math of things and just the costs, they become less of an increase overall. And so they said, like, having your first kid basically increases your costs by like $14,000 a year, and your second kid was something like 8, and then the third was like less than 3. And so then once you get to like 4 and 5, it's like every kid costs $1,000 more or whatever per year to have, because you get to use all the same stuff. They outgrow the car seat and you let the younger kid use it, and the same thing with the clothes and all the cribs and stuff like that. So it makes sense. It makes sense. And um, they kind of said that like the worst thing is having one kid or two kids and that's it. I don't necessarily think that's true. And this is where I would say like they're looking at it too much from a stress and economic standpoint, because I've known many people who were able to have one kid and wanted more, but for some reason they weren't able to, and that's one reason why they would probably advocate for more increase in reproductive technology for people like that. But I think that from a Christian standpoint, like kids are good, but even if you just have one kid, that one kid is good, and the value that one kid brings to your family is inestimable. So yeah, the cost for having one kid is relatively a bigger increase than having five overall. So it's not, you don't get as much bang for your buck, but you know the difference between having a kid and not having a kid is still should always be on the side of having the kid. And they talked about some interesting things in there too. I think it was in that one. About how like big families are even more. Maybe it was in the next one. More likely to adopt and things like that. It's like once you kind of figure out how to have a big family, you start to just appreciate it more. And I think that's a very biblical kind of a Christian thing, in that your capacity to love and foster love for kids grows. It's not a finite resource that gets used up. Your capacity increases. All right. The next one from 7 days ago was Inside the Deranged Anti-Natalist Movement. And this is a crazy video. And they show some of these people who, it's really this warped thing where they place suffering as this ultimate evil, and then they want humanity to exist, not to exist, because that will cause suffering to cease. And it's such, like, I think that's even literally, like, this is the serpent's plan in the garden. Like, God says, if you eat this fruit, you're going to die. And the serpent says, ooh, we can get rid of those people if we can get them to eat the fruit. Like that's literally his plan, is to, reduce suffering by reducing existence. They want like the heat death of the universe or whatever. Like, and some of these people are so crazy that they don't even want, I think it says somewhere in there like veganism. Yeah, I think this was one, like veganism leads you into these sort of conclusions. And then at the end of the video, they like showed their kids playing with the chickens on their farm or whatever to like piss off the vegans. Because the veganism thing's like, well, we shouldn't be killing animals for meat. That's so cruel. It's causing this suffering. But some of these people are basically of the point of view like, oh, we should destroy all humanity. But before humanity is destroyed, they need to destroy all animal life, because animals may achieve sentience in someday, and then they will be able to experience suffering, as they evolve into like a human-like species, and we want to prevent that too. So humans have to kill all animals and then kill themselves. And like this is supposed to be somehow like a benevolent and good system. And the crazy thing is, like, they're saying whatever by the numbers, how they're viewing this, like more and more people are starting to believe this and accept this. That's crazy. Okay. How and when is sex ed appropriate? This video, from 8 days ago, was pretty good. And it's interesting because they talked about Ayala, that Paul's put some stuff on there or whatever. And she's this crazy sex person. Whatever. She's not crazy. She's like autistic. And she's a sex worker or whatever. She's a prostitute. And they're like, oh, she's smart and we like her and stuff. And they're saying basically like she ended up that way because she was raised in a super fundamentalist home, and they didn't teach her anything or whatever. And what they're saying is like, you need to teach your kids about sex like early on, and the earlier on you teach them about it, the more like the less likely they are to basically mess around with it. They're more likely to wait until they're older and be more responsible and stuff like that. And they even said like abstinence only. Everybody says that it doesn't work, but that's not really true. Like the evidence shows it does work, but not as well as this method. And I believe that is actually right. And my wife and I have had a lot of conversations about this and tried to do some research and figure things out. And in a sense, like sex is, and this is the more Christian way to approach this, is to say sex is for marriage, but it's a wonderful thing in marriage, and it exists, and it explains your existence, it explains the existence of your children, and trying to like hide that or whatever from your kids is not good. Now I think that there's like an age appropriateness to this, and we have some resources that we found where basically first you need to teach your kids about like you have a body, you have private parts, like this is why they're private, what they are. You use the real names for things. You don't use like cutesy names for private parts, because that can put them in a position of being victimized by like predators and stuff like that. Like perverts and predators and stuff, they're uncomfortable. If a kid says like, "Why are you touching my penis?" they are uncomfortable, because they are people that are like sexually repressed, and they didn't deal with this stuff correctly when they were a kid, or they were abused or whatever. But like even just stuff like that, like it protects your kids from harm from people who want to deceive them and take advantage of them and stuff like that. As far as like the mechanics of it and all that stuff, that stuff progresses as they get a little older, but you really need to tell your kids this stuff like before they hit puberty, and hopefully before they're exposed to any kind of like adult materials, before you want to be sure that you're the one giving it to them. And then if they encounter that stuff, or their friends are talking about it, they'll be like, "Oh, that's not a good, I don't want that. That's not an appropriate form of seeing that information or whatever, like." And so really it does protect them. Now, as I say, where they differ a little bit is like Malcolm kind of talks about a little bit of this just assumption of like, at least for the man's going to be having sex with women before marriage. And he's talking about how like the sex act and the hormones involved, like the oxytocin and whatever the other one is, like vasopressin, or like there's these hormones that are like bonding hormones that basically, like, when you have sex with somebody, you're bonding yourself to them and you're creating this strong relational bond. If you have sex too much before you're married, you lose your ability to make strong bonds. But he's kind of saying like, oh, well, from a man's point of view, like there's like, that's a good way to basically like, you could use that to get a wife, which I'm like, well, you don't have to do that. Just wait until you're married. That's the Christian viewpoint, and it's possible, and it's great if you can do it. And if you didn't do it, it's okay. You can wait with the person you want to marry. You don't have to have sex in every relationship. So honestly, yeah, not a bad video. I think the Christian viewpoint is slightly different. Now, this next one, this pronatalist should support the dink lifestyle. Basically, they're saying like, these people are selfish and we should just let them do what they want because they're not going to exist anymore. I think this is one of the big weaknesses of their like religion, in not having a mechanism of evangelism, or really a mechanism of conversion or repentance, because I think that this dink lifestyle thing is very much something that's in the air. Like, and I even as a Christian, and even as a Christian who like waited for marriage and knew that like family is a good thing, I got a pretty significant dose of this, in so much as like, you're gonna have kids, you're gonna have kids someday, but you should wait because you want that time with just you and your wife, that you can have fun and like, just go on trips and like an extended honeymoon kind of thing. And it just so happened for my wife and I that for some medical reasons that she had, like, we could not. She was on birth control because it would have been dangerous if we had a baby right away, because she had some other medical stuff, and so we didn't have kids right away. But as soon as we did have our first kid, and I've said this other places, I was pretty upset, I think, because I felt like I had been lied to in in the kind of communication that, like, the marriage thing is great, like that relationship was really great, but, like, having kids is a little bit of a drag and a responsibility. Like, no, having kids is amazing. It's wonderful. It challenges you to grow. It challenges you to become a better person. You'll never be the same person you were after you have kids. And so when I look at these dink people, and I think that they're kind of leaning into it because they have so many other avenues. Like, they have a whole bunch of people telling them why they shouldn't have kids. And basically, to me, they're saying, like, they're kind of narcissistic and whatever. To me, I think that a lot of this looks like people convincing themselves or whatever that they have something great. And most of the people in those videos are, like, look like they're pretty young, like not even 30 or whatever. And if at that time they have a bunch of other dink friends, they can all think it's great. That stuff gets boring. It gets boring just going to trivia night every week and going to vacations just to the same places, whatever. Like, and the only people you have to share it with is your partner. Like, it's great to share stuff with your partner, but seeing kids learn and grow and comprehend the world is amazing. And I think that many, many people in that situation are going to see some of their friends have kids, whether they make a decision or it just happens or just whatever. And over time, they're going to be less and less certain about, did we make the right choice? And this is an interesting thing in that since these reproductive technologies are out in the world, the opportunity for that window to stay open is longer. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a big baby boom of, like, 40-year-old people or something, if that doesn't start being a thing, as people kind of catch on. So I have more faith in people's ability to change and grow and mature than Malcolm and Simone do, because they're, like I said, basically their thing is, like, if you don't get our thing, if you don't get our pronatalist weird future descendant worship religion, then we don't want you to participate. I think that people don't know what they want. Malcolm and Simone seem to know what they want, and I don't think they understand how rare of a thing knowing what you want is. And there's going to be many, many people that live for a while in this dink scenario, and they're going to grow out of it. The next one was this one. Avoiding hippie nonsense when searching for theological truth. The Tesseract model of God. And this is, like, explaining their weird religion a little bit more. And it's an interesting thing, because to me it really highlights, like, the truth of the incarnation, in so much as, like, like the Tesseract, so that's their concept of, a 4-dimensional cube. We can't understand it, but we can see, like, the 3-dimensional shadow of it. And like, I get into these arguments with Jacob or whatever, the Jewish conception of things as it is now, I think very much in response to Christianity, and really more or less since the Middle Ages, influenced by philosophy, but the overwhelming emphasis on, like, That's not God. What you experience from God is not God. Your knowledge of God is not God. Like everything that is not God is not God. And God is so unknowable and so distant and impersonal, really, that they decry Christians as being idolaters and all this stuff. And I think Malcolm and Simone are right in a sense of like you can't, like, whatever the experience people have, they have a real experience. And the reality is that all of our subjective understanding of religious experience is wrong to a certain degree, but it doesn't mean that what was revealed wasn't true. It's just the problem is the limitation of our own understanding. And I think they said something about like why psychedelics are dumb in there. Maybe that was just me thinking about something Paul said instead. I think, but basically, I think I think what they say in that video does make sense, and it's part of why they are not like trying to convert people from other religions to their religion. But it's definitely, it's one of these things where like the patterns are correct, but the words are unfamiliar to a Christian audience. So most Christians would hear it and be like, oh, they worship a 4-dimensional cube. And it's like, no, that's not what they worship. They're using that as a metaphor to explain the fact that though we believe God reveals himself to us, our understanding of that revelation is always going to be flawed and finite and incomplete. It doesn't mean that it's not true, and it doesn't mean that God's not real. Although, whatever their conception of God really is I guess it's like their future descendants or something. Which I thought about. Like, I've thought about, like, what if those sons of God in Genesis 6, like, what if that's, like, people from the future or something going back in time? Like, and especially misguidedly, like, not taking the Genesis account seriously, but thinking like, we're going to enlighten humanity by going back in time to our ancient ancestors. And they set the thing for like, 3000 BC or something, a bit before the flood. And then they go there and they see all these beautiful women and they start marrying them. And like, I don't know, that's just like, it's a weird way I've thought about, like, that could explain things. I don't know. It's not something I would ever commit to on any level, but it's an interesting one. And then I can't remember exactly which other ones I looked at. Some, I think there's a few of these older ones that I looked at. I know there's definitely one about, some stuff about trad stuff, which, I have a little bone of contention with the trad thing, because I think there are some problems that a lot of Christians really ignore that. Like, so, I mean, some of this stuff is like, friends are a pointless indulgence. Like, okay, well, maybe not. Like, maybe it's not pointless. Maybe friends are a Chesterton's fence that you don't understand the function of yet. Okay, yeah, so I looked at this one because this one pops up and I thought, oh, that's interesting. The old ways won't save you. So that's like this thing of, and they said some really good points in there, things that I've really talked about in some of my tectonic school, like, philosophy as I'm working through it. Like, there is a certain aspect of preservation of history that is valuable, preserving tradition, but we have to choose some of it to let go, or we have to adapt it, or it can't remain exactly as it was. And so we have to make choices about it, and like, so just trying to like go back and be like the most trad Catholic and have like the little Catholic community, or being Amish, doesn't really work. So overall, there's definitely a lot more I'm going to check out on here because I think a lot of it's really interesting, and I do appreciate that they don't have weird taboos about asking questions about these things or thinking about them because they are really important things. Like, I think they're thinking about and talking about all the important things that a lot of Christians are ignoring. Like, even like, and like the ones that think like Christian nationalism is the answer or starting a commune is the answer. Like, that's not going to be a real solution. And I think they have a lot of stuff in the center that should be in the center of Christianity. But what they're missing out on is all that periphery. Because there's a lot of people that, for their plan, are not the elect, that Christianity still sees a value in. Because people have value in sharing their wisdom with others, even if they don't reproduce. Because we likely will end up at a place where we have a growing population of elderly people and less young people to support the economy and things like that, which from an economic standpoint is a problem. But it also means that a lot of those young people will have the opportunity to maybe get to know and learn from older people. And people can gain wisdom through making bad choices just as much as they can through making good ones, sometimes even more. And so the mistakes that people are making are not, it may be the end of their genetic line, it may be the end of their last name. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of their legacy. And I think that's something that Christianity has to offer, that anyone can come to Christ, and then what you have in your life and your experience, your negative experiences, can all be used as a form of wisdom. And likewise, I think that Christianity has a use and a value and a place for the single people, the people who are not able to have children. It has a place for the immigrants, and all those people have value. Some of the problem is that we've focused so much on reaching those people on the margins, people, like there's going to be all the trans people. There's going to be so many people that become detrans, and I think will come to Christ. But having normal marriages will not probably be an option for them. It doesn't mean that they don't have anything left to provide that has value, but that option is off the table. But I think that the problem that we've had is that we focus so much on all those exceptions that we ignore the rule. And the normal rule for most people is that God made marriage and family as part of his original design for creation, something very good, and a means through which we understand ourselves and learn to understand him. Because you will never understand what it means for God to be a father until you are a father. You can understand your father, but you'll never understand your father as much as you can once you become a father. And so I think we don't have to be afraid about saying that is like the normal and good thing. And as much as people desire that, in some ways secretly, I think now, because our culture is so jacked up, that like saying I want to get married and have kids is like, people say, how dare you be so selfish. Well, what Malcolm and Simone are doing is great because it's removing that stigma, which is, that's one of the woke, the sacraments of the woke religion, removing stigmas. Well, they're removing the stigma that the woke people have placed on the normal people of saying that it's bad to want to be married and have kids. So I applaud them for that, and I will definitely glean what wisdom I can from them and I explore this stuff more. But yeah, definitely got to check out Lizard People Are Real, and whatever other weird ones there. Trad Wives are Progressive Conspiracy. I don't know. We gotta see. So all sorts of interesting stuff. So, all right. Well, this is reaching the point of an hour, so I'll stop here, and hopefully people will leave comments because that's what I want is comments and interaction and other people to tell me that I'm not crazy for agreeing with these people. I'll talk to you later.